When we test the shoulder, we often focus on internal and external rotation strength. Now, that matters, but also often sporting actions such as throwing or serving or tackling, they require athletes to produce and transfer force through long lever positions and often at speed. Plus, these positions are often where the shoulder is most vulnerable. This then is where the athletic shoulder test or the ASH test can provide a useful lens. So the ASH test, the athletic shoulder test, has been developed by performance director and physiotherapist Ben Ashworth, and it involves testing prone long lever isometric shoulder strength in 3 different positions. So the ASH I position with 180 degrees of shoulder abduction, the Y with 135 degrees of shoulder abduction, and the T position with 90 degrees of shoulder abduction. These positions are not interchangeable. Each one of them gives a slightly different perspective of the shoulder and the kinetic change through the upper body. This 2025 publication, led by Ben Ashworth, published in the Sports Journal, gives a useful, in this case, baseball-specific rationale, noting that these different positions correspond to different shoulder abduction demands across thrown positions, in this case with baseball pitchers. So this longer lever position then potentially offers greater ecological validity, especially with our overhead or our throwing athletes compared to our IR testing. But of course, that's not to say they're not both valuable, especially when combined together for insights in both short and long lever positions. Let's take a look at the protocols now for conducting these tests. And as has been the case throughout this athlete testing series in collaboration with VOLD, we have highlighted the importance of consistency with your testing protocols. So the setup for these is with the athlete lying in a prone position, so face down. We want their forehead resting on a block to standardize and also relax the neck position. The testing arm then is straight out in its position with the hand lying flat on the force plate. Now, using a force plate like Forcedex is the gold standard for ASH testing, but if you do not have the budget or access to force plates, then we could also conduct this with dynamometers, either our fixed frame dynamometer, such as the force frame, or our handheld dynamometer, such as one from the VOLD Dynamo series. Now, I have videos on both of those different technologies, so if that's the tool you're looking to conduct the ASH test with, then definitely take a look at those videos to make sure you know the key points for using those technologies. Next up, we have a critical difference in the protocol between the I position and the Y and the T. So you can see that for the I position, the non-testing arm is by the athlete's side. However, for the Y and T positions, we want to limit their ability to anchor off that non-testing arm. So as you can see, we've actually got it bent here and resting on the lower back. We'll also ask them to point their toes towards the floor, again to try and limit a movement in the lower body. Remember that these are isometric tests, so we don't want to see any movement or changes in limb length that shows that it's no longer an isometric test. A really critical piece of advice I have for sports scientists conducting this test, which to be honest is not something I've necessarily always done myself, is also then to watch the athlete, not necessarily just the screen when you're conducting the test, because it's really important that we look out for compensation strategies that the athlete might use to try and leverage themselves to get more force in those positions. And who better to illustrate what we're talking about here than getting advice from Ben himself on what you're looking for visually with the athlete when conducting this test.
So what we see here is some compensations. We can either see someone shorten through the lever, so they bend the elbow, and that's probably a glenohumeral joint compensation. or we see someone dive forward through the shoulder. They lead with the shoulder. We see that in the tackle itself, in tennis players, but that doesn't improve the force output. It just changes the strategy of how they recruit muscles around the scapula. The next bit we see is people are unable to stabilize the canoe to fire the cannon. So we get some rotation through the pelvis, and that's probably a trunk rotation strength deficit. And then finally, we see someone kick out into extension and abduction in their leg. And that might be to do with the posterior oblique sling and how they transfer force from the base of support on the opposite hip into and across the shoulder girdle.
Ben's work then has shown the value of looking at the peak force output, both absolute and relative to body mass in the test, but also in the rate of force development, particularly the early rate of force development in the test. That has implications then for our cueing of our testing, much like the isometric mid-thigh pull, which we talked about in another video. With this in mind, I've seen Ben recommend then testing separately for peak force in certain trials and rate of force development in a different trial because of the need for cueing, with peak force being a gradual build up to their maximum output, compared to then the rate of force development trials in which you're cueing them to go as fast as possible. As always, of course, with rate of force development, we do find that it's more variable than our peak force measures. In Ben's earlier publication from 2025, he found that peak force showed excellent reliability across trials, whereas rate of force development was not as high, but it was still acceptable in terms of reliability. But that's definitely something to look at in your own data sets. We may, in certain athletes, such as swimmers who have those bilateral demands, be looking at our left to right differences and our potential asymmetries across the shoulders. Although, of course, in our throwing athletes, we'd likely expect to see notable difference in left to right side, given the massive difference in demands across those shoulders with only throwing through one side. Here, then, you can see some normative data that has been shared through our Vol Guide to Shoulders that myself and Ben co-wrote together. As always, of course, with normative data, we have to be a little bit cautious just in terms of differences across our populations, across the sporting demands, the type of athletes we're dealing with, as well as what level of athlete. But I think these can provide a useful starting point in terms of our force outputs. I've also seen Ben talk about how in some elite environments, values of rate of force development around or above 500 newtons per second may be a useful reference point. As always, rate of force development needs to be interpreted carefully because it's more variable, and we need to be cautious around comparing with normative data. That combination then of peak force and rate of force development can be really insightful. So as an example, perhaps an athlete is demonstrating good peak force outputs through the various shoulder positions, but a lower rate of force development. This suggests that they have that strength capacity, but struggle to access the force quickly. For this athlete then to develop that capacity, we want to have more explosive work built into their training program. For some great examples of exercises and progressions that you can use both for increasing that strength capacity or the speed of that force expression, then definitely take a look at Ben's Athletic Shoulder YouTube channel. So of course, the ASH test then is just one tool in our toolbox for assessing the health and performance of our athlete's shoulders. Ideally, we combine it with other forms of information, as I already mentioned, then the ER, IR strength testing that we could do, but also then I think range of motion around the shoulder, understanding how much mobility they have access to. Of course, we want to understand the clinical context of their shoulder health as well, alongside any symptoms and crucially their injury history, which is always critical for all our athletes. If you want to dive deeper then into the ASH test itself, or potentially just more broadly around shoulder assessment. I'll put a link below to the Vold practitioner guide I mentioned on shoulders, as well as Ben's Athletic Shoulder YouTube channel. And if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe and come back soon for another Sports Science Insights video.